I see a lot of people are eager to start interpreting video games and to share their views with other people both online and in real life. That's great. I couldn't be more excited about that. That's why I'm making this video, to help steer those people in the right direction. I won't be telling you what to think or put words in your mouth. Rather, I'll be giving you some tips and insight into analysing narratives, as well as informing you of some very fatal mistakes which will sink your interpretation of a narrative the moment you employ either of them. The number one thing to keep in mind when you're going about analysing a story, be it a video game, a novel, a poem, or what have you, is to avoid equating the narrative or narrator to the narrative's creator. In university, we're berated when we start a sentence off by saying, "the author of the novel says," as opposed to "the narrator of the novel says," and for very good reasons. Both of these people exist, and they're not at all the same person. A creator, or artist, effectively creates this entity, the narrator, with a personality and mindset completely unique and of its own. Even if he or she isn't a character physically present in the narrative, he or she is a character and not the creator him or herself. Usually the narrator will express his or her opinions, which is reflected in the language used. Remember that this is the narrator talking and not the creator. By making this distinction, you're allowing the creator, the artist, to view things from different perspectives and to channel the experiences of other people. You allow the creator to talk about what may possibly be perceived as a sensitive subject. The creator is allowed to ask questions, to pose dilemmas, to talk of ideas, philosophies, problems, etc., without actually having an opinion or choosing a side. In this sense, it's simply wrong to call a sexist narrator a sexist creator. If you refuse to make this distinction, you're denying the artist his creative and free expression, something that allows for the great diversity we see in art today. Not only is it disagreeable to deny someone the freedom to express oneself, it's also a very ineffective way of communicating art and ideas. The reason why the concept of a narrator works so well is because discussions can be had and anything can be brought to light in an indirect way. You can stir up a legitimate discussion simply by having your narrator talk of controversial issues. In this sense, the creator is not as important as the narrator, because the narrator is the one driving forward the agenda, the argument, the idea, or the opinion. The narrator's creator is simply the puppet master pulling the strings of the narrator. He's outside the intellectual arena, pushing the buttons to let the lions out of their dens. He himself isn't in there fighting the other half-naked men covered in oil. Make of that what you will. Determining what the creator thinks or implies, or what he or she was thinking whilst creating the art piece, is redundant. It's not about what the artist thinks. If it were, why even employ the construct of a narrator to begin with? The primary goal is to make people think, to promote discussion by making the first step, as it were. There's also no single answer to what the art piece means, thus discovering the artist's intention is irrelevant to the meaning of the final product. I'll go into more detail near the end of the video. But only slightly. Only slightly. The second piece of advice I'd like to give you is to look more closely at certain storytelling elements the narrator will throw at you. I've heard a lot of people oppose the idea of female strippers and sex workers or strip clubs in video games, for example, and I don't believe they did their best to think it through. I'm erring on the side of caution, giving people the benefit of the doubt that they didn't try hard enough, rather than to suggest that they're pushing an agenda. Anon's razor is a handy tool in logical reasoning that will help prevent you from making this kind of nasty mistake. It's better to be safe than to start building those straw men. When the game throws in the setting of a strip club paired with small characters in the form of strippers, I want it to fit in the proposed narrative. If it has no purpose in driving a narrative forwards, it's jarring and should probably be left out. It's like adding salt to bacon or building a column in the middle of the living room. If they're not contributing in any way, they're not supposed to be there. Let's take a look at Deus Ex Human Revolution and how the game handles strippers and sex workers. In the second overworld of the game, a Chinese city, the first place you enter is a strip club / brothel in the not-so-nice part of town. You meet up with a lady sex worker who laments her missing colleague and asks you to help her out. Other than running this side mission for her, the brothel and the sex workers out on the streets contribute to the atmosphere in this part of the city, so I wouldn't agree with anyone who'd argue that they're just there to titillate me as a heterosexual white male. Obviously, nice parts of town don't have their sex workers out in the open, and the fact that the local authorities never interact with these women also says a lot about the kind of place you're in. They ignore them, meaning the laws are probably adjusted to account for their presence or something like that, and it also tells you that it wasn't a recent development. For people to not look baffled or shocked in any way also tells you that they've been desensitized by it over time. So the mere visual presence of these sex workers tells you a lot about the government and the law enforcement and the shady parts of town you're in and its inhabitants. Obviously this contributes to the player's experiments and interpretation, and of course to the game's overall narrative. To pose the idea that these sex workers are superfluous to telling the story is therefore false. Were they not in the game's narrative and the player's experience would be completely different. This is true for other similar storytelling elements as well. Things like domestic abuse or animal cruelty, despicable as both these acts are, help shape the setting and the universe you find yourself in, and to suggest that they only detract from the narrative and enforce stereotypes is only one interpretation. I'm not saying I'd like my games to include the aforementioned atrocities, but if they did include them, that would tell me a lot about the characters involved in the game, and it would give me a completely different outlook on the place and time I find myself in. In literature, we talk of indirect and direct characterization that shape the characters of a narrative. Indirect being what the character does, how he speaks and what he says, and direct being what the narrator explicitly tells me about the character. In video games, the act of showing a man beating his wife is indirect characterization for both the man and the woman. The man's character is that of someone who beats his wife, and the woman's character being that of a victim of domestic abuse, both along with all the implications and results that come with that. If in a video game I hear about a man in a suit who sells all kinds of illegal substances, I won't think very highly of that man, and this is part of my experience in the overall narrative. It's not inherently bad for the game to include such a character, even if I do disapprove of the character's actions or personality. So long as it's not unconnected to the game's narrative, there's no reason to want it removed from the game. This of course extends to strip clubs, domestic abuse, and anything else in the world you could possibly disagree with. In summary, just because it's ugly business, provocative, or perhaps overused, doesn't mean it doesn't fit in the narrative. The creator is trying to shape our experiences, and if that requires us to be appalled at a cheating husband or a dead dog, then so be it. If it fits, it fits, so think twice before you ask for the removal or condemnation of if it fits, it fits, so think twice before you ask for the removal or condemnation of certain storytelling elements. Before I go, I'd like to share one more small bit of information with you regarding the interpretation surrounding an artist's work and that artist's personal feelings. An artist and his or her narrator, as we've seen earlier, are two unique things. Consequently, the creator and the creation are also two entities wholly separable from each other. The artist does not have the final say in what his artwork means. He or she, much like everyone else, cannot be the arbiter of what's valid as an interpretation and what isn't. Only reality is the arbiter of right and wrong in a factual sense. Though the artist creates his or her product with an idea in mind, this idea is only one interpretation. The end product can represent many other things, providing the evidence is present to support other interpretations. Ultimately, if no evidence supports interpretation, even if it's the artist's interpretation of his or her own work, it will fall flat. So to summarize, the creator and the narrator are two different people, and the views expressed by either is not necessarily indicative of the other's views. If it fits cozily in the narrative, it shouldn't be removed, and art has multiple interpretations, all of which are dependent upon evidence for their existence and not the creator's consent. Hopefully all of you are now armed with the knowledge to avoid some of the dreaded logical fallacies, and we can all have more meaningful discussions about video games and talking breasts. I mean women. Thank you for watching.